All right, welcome everybody to the Compelling Questions lecture. Today we have Kevin. Sorry, Kevin. It's Levin.
Got it.
Kevin Levin. He's going to talk about Confederate statues that are being taken down, Confederate monuments that are being taken down, and why that is, why that's happening, and the history behind it. And also, I'd just like to give a special thanks to the Marjorie Scoboria Fund, which helps fund this lecture series. And without further ado, Kevin, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks, Danny. I appreciate that. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for spending at least part of your afternoon with me. I don't know, most of you are in Massachusetts, but obviously it's a really nice day out. You could be outside enjoying the warm temperatures, but I appreciate you taking at least an hour to join us today. So yeah, I think, you know, if you're paying attention to the news over the last few years, if you're interested in history, this is certainly a topic that has been in the news, at least for the past, at least going back to 2015. Monuments honoring Confederate leaders, honoring the Confederacy, have been coming down. Just this past year and a half, roughly, I would say somewhere around 110 have been removed since the police murder of George Floyd back in late May of 2020. Do I have that right? Yeah, about 2020. And I think for a lot of people who are following this debate, they're wondering why these monuments are divisive. They're wondering about sort of the origin of the controversy. I think quite often people reduce this debate simply down to politics, that this is sort of the latest round of a broader culture war. And I think it certainly is part of that larger discussion. But one of the things that I want to do for you today is give you an opportunity to step back a bit and take in a much broader historical perspective that may help us to better understand why these monuments not only have been controversial over the last few years, but have been controversial from day one. In other words, from the very day, you know, in which many of these monuments were dedicated, they've been controversial. And I want to sort of highlight why that is. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a bunch of slides. I'm not going to read a paper or anything. I'm going to sort of talk through some images, leave plenty of time for Q&A, and so that'll give you a chance to ask questions, share your thoughts, etc. I want to be clear at the outset that I'm not here to try to convince you as to whether or not monuments should be removed or whether they should remain in place. That is certainly up to you to decide based on any number of factors. Again, as a historian, as a history educator, I see my job as simply to give you some tools with which you can think through some of the questions that are, that divide people over this, and hopefully help you, arrive at your own conclusion. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and we can get started. And as I mentioned, so all of you can see that, I assume? Just a quick nod. Yeah. So as I mentioned, the monuments certainly have become controversial over the last few years. And I think if you go back to June of 2015, that really is sort of the catalyst for the most recent wave of monument removals. And of course, you're looking at Dylann Roof. Many of you remember that back in June of 2015, he walked into a historic Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, sat in a Bible study session for about an hour, and at the end of that, proceeded to gun down 9 of those church members. He was later caught, and what really sort of, again, served as the catalyst for all of this controversy about how we remember and commemorate the Confederacy are the photographs that surfaced of Dylann Roof, like this one, a couple of days later. You see him waving the Confederate flag. There were a number of other photographs of him in front of Confederate monuments. And then there was even one that showed him posing in front of Sullivan's Island, a fort on Sullivan's Island near Charleston, South Carolina, where roughly 40% of enslaved Africans entered what was then the colonies, the English colonies. And so Ruth, in a way, was sort of framing his attack in Charleston within a broader historical context. He saw himself as following in a long line of white supremacists. In fact, he was very explicit that he was attempting to start a race war. And so, of course, the Confederate flag on the Capitol grounds in Columbia, South Carolina came down. A number of other states, including Alabama, took its Confederate flags down from the Capitol grounds. And that started this sort of call, this push for a broader removal of Confederate iconography. Just sort of course, jump to Charlottesville in 2017 and the Unite the Right rally. And we see the same thing. Charlottesville had been pushing to remove two large equestrian monuments, one to Robert E. Lee, which you can see in the right-hand corner, and another one honoring Stonewall Jackson. And of course, since then, Charlottesville has removed both of these monuments. And so by 2017, cities like New Orleans, Baltimore, Dallas, large cities, southern cities, had really sort of, begun the push to remove their Confederate statues and monuments in specifically public spaces. You can jump ahead more recently. Of course, I've already mentioned the police murder of George Floyd back in May of 2020. But of course, just last January 6th of 2021, the image of the Confederate flag in the United States Capitol, I think serves as a reminder that that the Confederacy, or the memory of the Confederacy, is still very much a divisive topic. And throughout this period, monuments and flags continue to be removed. Again, since May of 2020, roughly 110 Confederate monuments have been removed. There are still hundreds of them of various sizes that litter public spaces, throughout the South and even beyond the former states that made up the Confederacy. And so to sort of jump back and try to gain a broader historical perspective, I think it's important to understand that the first monuments to the Confederacy come out of defeat, come out of Confederate defeat after 1865. I think we need to acknowledge the scale of destruction throughout parts of the Confederacy. Certainly the number of deaths suffered by the Confederacy during the Civil War. And then, of course, probably the most significant factor, the end of slavery itself. By the spring of 1865, roughly 4 million people that were once enslaved are now free. And so everything that Confederates were fighting to achieve with independence has come crumbling down, right? And so I think for many white Southerners, the challenge in rebuilding or reconstructing the former Confederacy, the states of the former Confederacy, the question is, how do you rebuild, right? How do you begin to rebuild? And part of that rebuilding is trying to make sense of defeat. What was it about? Why did we lose? Why did the side that was supposed to be on God's side ultimately lose against the Yankees, right? And part of that reconstruction involves beginning to commemorate the cause, what they would have called the lost cause, to commemorate the men who gave their lives and to make sense of defeat. And one way they did that was declaring that, of course, they didn't lose in the end, that they had achieved a broader moral victory. Even though they were defeated on the battlefield, their cause remained righteous. They could still hold up their generals as Christian warriors. And so the first monuments that go up in the post-war South during this period of Reconstruction, I just want to sort of remind us, we're talking about a period where formerly enslaved men are serving in state government, are voting for the first time. This is happening because, of course, the US military is present in parts of the post-war South, protecting the voting rights of African Americans. And they are, of course, serving in all levels of government, especially at the state level. And in some states, they, of course, are the majority of the state legislature. And so, of course, they are pushing through their own agendas at this point in time. So this also has colored what the world looks like for white Southerners, what they are attempting to overcome, right? What they are pushing to regain, coming out of the Civil War. And so the first statues and monuments that go up in cemeteries. They go up in places that are about commemorating the dead, honoring the fallen, right? One of the reasons why the first monuments go up in cemeteries, predominantly cemeteries, is because military reconstruction, the presence of the US military in the post-war South, prevents former Confederates from publicly celebrating the Confederacy. So former Confederates are not allowed to wear their uniforms or wear their insignia in public. They're not allowed to celebrate the Confederacy with parades. Of course, in contrast with the fact that many formerly enslaved people are doing just that. They're parading through the streets, they're celebrating freedom. And so the cemetery becomes a sort of a sanctuary place for former Confederates where they can safely honor the fallen and honor the cause as well. And so here's an example from Winchester, Virginia. It's mainly women's groups that are doing this, that are organizing these statues, what are called the Ladies Memorial Associations. This is another example in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. There are thousands of unidentified Confederates, mainly disinterred from the Gettysburg battlefield in Pennsylvania, that were brought down and reburied in Hollywood Cemetery. And of course, you have to imagine that many of these communities didn't have sufficient funds to build a statue, right, or to order a statue. And so in many cases, they use just the natural resources lying around locally. And so in this case, they're pulling the stones out of the James River just beyond the landscape that you see here. The river's right behind it. And so they end up with this sort of classical sort of pyramid structure. But this would have been, of course, the site of Confederate Memorial Day celebrations, other kinds of Confederate commemorations, again, away from the more public settings of the street, public parks, etc. And so this is the first generation, if you will, of Confederate monuments that appear. These are not, for the most part, the monuments that are up for debate, that are being debated right now in many communities or have been removed across parts of the country. They tend to be, as you'll see, monuments placed in very different locations, very different places. So this is a chart that that is actually a graph that's very sort of helpful for our purposes, because you can see on the far left, you can see the years that make up the war. You can see roughly the 12-year period, 15-year period that makes up Reconstruction. And then what you really want to notice and acknowledge here is that spike that begins to sort of become noticeable around 1890 and 1900. Roughly between 1890 and 1930, the vast majority of Confederate monuments go up, right? So it's not right after the Civil War, it's a couple decades later. And there are a couple reasons for that. One of them, of course, is the fact that Reconstruction ends. The US military leaves finally by the end of the 1870s. White Southerners have regained control, redeemed their states, as they would have said, and regained political control. And once they regain political control of their states, they can begin to take steps to more actively commemorate the Confederacy in much more public spaces. And so you'll see this in a second as I show you some examples. But one of the things I want to drive home for us, you can see on this map, and of course, these are the former Confederate states, and the circles that you see here basically mark monuments, Confederate monuments or statues. And again, the vast majority of these are going up between 1890 and 1930. And what I want you to notice is a couple things here. First, I want you to sort of notice the dates here in the states. So these are the dates where these states rewrite their state constitutions. And why that is significant is because when they're rewriting their state constitutions, they are taking steps to legally prevent African Americans from voting, from taking part in politics, right? And that's happening just at the time in which these monuments are going up. Okay, so these states do this, they rewrite their state constitutions roughly around the same time. But it's the brown areas that I want you to notice, because those brown areas denote counties where more than half of the population is Black, African American. And so today, quite often, you'll hear people say, well, these monuments no longer reflect the collective values of their respective communities, the people who live in them. But one of the things I want you to notice here, especially in those brown areas, right, is that in many of these counties, these monuments never reflected the collective history or the shared values of everyone who lived there. It's just that the vast majority or the majority of the population in many of these counties were never allowed to take part in the kinds of debates and organization that's necessary to put up one of these monuments or statues. So many of these statues and monuments never reflected the shared past of the people who live in their communities or in these communities. Okay, so I want to make sure that that point is crystal clear as we go through this. And so notice that by the end of the 1870s into the 1880s, the monuments come out of the cemeteries and end up in much more public spaces. So here, of course, in Augusta, Georgia, right in the center of a street, you can't miss it. It towers over everything. And the inscriptions, of course, become really important in understanding how white Southerners are thinking about the Confederacy. And one of the things I want you to sort of acknowledge, beginning with this photograph, is that they are always explicit about race. This is not something that white Southerners tried to hide, right? The sort of tipping of their hat to white supremacy. They're proud of this. They are proud of the fact that, or believe, I should say, that white people should be in control, that African Americans should be relegated to second-class status, right? And so these monuments are a way to connect the present with the past. So just as their fathers and eventually grandfathers fought for the preservation of slavery and the racial status quo during the Civil War, so they are doing the same thing in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, and so forth. It's a way to link, again, the past and the present, right? And so we can see how these monuments reflect those choices and that very agenda, right? Think about sort of honoring someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest in Memphis in 1905. This monument has been removed. In fact, Nathan Bedford Forrest and his wife were both buried below the base, and they've been removed as well. But Forrest, of course, many of you may know, was a Confederate general. He was perhaps responsible for one of the largest racial massacres of Black United States soldiers at a place called Fort Pillow in April of 1864, Fort Pillow, Tennessee. After the war, he became one of the early leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. But before the Civil War, he was, of course, he made a fortune as a slave trader in Memphis. And so think about the kinds of people that are being honored in public spaces, in public parks, like Memphis in 1905. But probably the most significant monument dedicated at this point, and I'm going to come back to this toward the end, the Lee Monument, is the Robert E. Lee Monument, dedicated in Richmond in 1890. Eventually, 5 large Confederate monuments came to define what is called Monument Avenue in what's called Richmond's West End neighborhood. One of the things I want you to notice about this is first the size of the crowd. There were certainly some estimates placed the crowd size over 100,000. This is, of course, overwhelmingly a white crowd. But the other thing I want you to notice here is that this is an open field. In fact, if you look toward the left of the monument, you can see what looks to be or appears to be two roads sort of intersecting. By the time this monument was dedicated, this part of Richmond was being reimagined, developed into a brand new neighborhood, right? And so these monuments came to, they sort of served as part of a real estate venture. They were a way to attract families to this new section of Richmond, where houses would soon, of course, dot the landscape, mainly homes for wealthy white families. And they were very explicit about the fact that this neighborhood was being set aside for white families. In fact, what's interesting about Monument Avenue is the way in which the statues or monuments themselves were used to sell the empty lots, where these families would build their homes. And so you can see on the left, here's two examples from a Richmond newspaper that I found. And this is the Stonewall Jackson monument that was dedicated, I think, in 1914. But even before the monument was dedicated, this is from 1913, you can see how it's being used to sell these open plots of land, right? So you can see, of course, the forest behind it. These families can imagine purchasing these lots and living within eyesight of a Confederate general like Stonewall Jackson. But if you look to the right, you'll see under that little box restrictions, right? And if you can't read it, I'll do my best here. It says, no lots can ever be sold or rented in Monument Avenue Park to any person of African descent. So it's very clear how these monuments came to define or shape segregation in the former capital of the Confederacy. These monuments were used to help define and reinforce where African Americans were allowed to live in Richmond and where white Richmonders were allowed to live. And so in a way, what you're seeing is how these monuments, you're seeing the work that they did to prop up and reinforce the racial line in a city like Richmond. And there's nothing unusual about that. These kinds of restrictions you can find in many cities across the country, especially in the South at this time. But I'm going to come back to this point toward the end in trying to frame why these monuments are no longer in Richmond, why all of them have been removed. Another way to approach these monuments and statues is to look at the dedication speeches that were given. And these are very easy to find. And I'll just give you two examples to help us here. Many of these dedication addresses were delivered by former Confederates, this one by Wiley Nash in Mississippi in 1908. Notice it's in front of a public building. This is the courthouse. And I won't read all of this to you, but this is part of Nash's address. And again, very explicit about the work that they expected these statues to do, the meaning that they attached decades after the Civil War. Number 5 is, I think, very clear. What will these statues help us do? Nash poses to the crowd. It will help to a true understanding of home rule, who will rule at home, and local self-government, contending for which the South lost so many of her best and bravest. It will serve to keep the white people of the South united, a thing so necessary to keep, protect, preserve, and transmit our true Southern social system, our cherished Southern civilization. Again, when we look at statues and monuments, I want you to think about the meaning that people attach to it at the time. Quite often people, I think, make a mistake in assuming that statues are history lessons. They are an attempt to tell a dispassionate story about the past or an objective story about history. Monuments are always about the present, or I should say the moment in which they are dedicated. I think you learn a lot more about the meaning that people attach to them, say in 1908, than anything about the 1860s and the Civil War. And that's the difference perhaps between history and memory. Here's perhaps an even better example of what I'm trying to get at. This is Silent Sam, another Confederate soldier statue that was dedicated at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1913. This statue is no longer on campus. It was pulled down a couple of years ago by activists and students, many of whom have been clamoring for decades. I should say students have been clamoring for decades to remove this statue. Again, it was dedicated by a Confederate veteran by the name of Julian Carr. And this is just a excerpt from that dedication address. And what I want to point out to you is the second paragraph, where he says, "I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, howbeit it is rather personal. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, where of course Robert E. Lee's army surrendered, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village, she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings, where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers, United States soldiers." So ask yourself, why is Julian Carr 50 years after the end of the war bringing up this event that takes place in April of 1865? And I think what he's doing here is, again, linking the present and the past. Remember, by 1913, you have a generation of white Southerners that never experienced the war, never experienced Reconstruction. And I think for that older generation, especially for the veterans themselves, it is a way to remind this younger generation of their responsibilities to uphold the racial status quo. So just as the end of the war brought down that racial hierarchy and allowed a formerly enslaved woman, to insult a white Southern lady, it is the responsibility of young white Southerners again in 1913 to make sure that never happens, to rally around the cause of white supremacy. And again, Julian Carr is very explicit here. He's not trying to hide anything from his crowd, right? From the audience, right? They are all, in a sense, with him on this. And so again, when we're talking about what these statues mean today, we have to keep in mind how they were understood at the time, right? And make sure that we, I think, appreciate the extent to which Americans were focused on the issues of race and white supremacy, just how important it was for them. Just a reminder that, again, just like the Ladies Memorial Association were responsible for the earliest Confederate monuments, it's the United Daughters of the Confederacy, formed in the 1890s, that is responsible for many of the Confederate monuments that went up during that sort of spike period that we looked at earlier. And these chapters are all over the country. I love this photograph because it's Tacoma, Washington. You don't think of the UDC as would be present all the way out west, but there was a chapter here in Boston, Massachusetts. In fact, there was a Confederate monument dedicated in Boston Harbor in the 1960s that no longer stands. So they were across the country. But their greatest work, their most important work, was not the monuments. As much as we focus on them, in my estimation, their most significant contribution, for better or for worse, is their attempt to control history textbooks. And if you're following the news right now, you know that, of course, states across the country are attempting to control what is being taught in our history classrooms across the country. The UDC understood that if you control what is taught in the classroom, you control, in a sense, the next generation. You have a sense, you have a way of sort of politically engaging the next generation and ensuring that they rally around your agenda. And you can see, of course, they're very explicit. They publish handbooks that they send out to schools across the country, and they tell you exactly what to reject. And you can see, of course, it's underlined here. It's one of the reasons why the lost cause narrative, this pro-Confederate memory of the war, is still very much with us, even in 2022. I think you have the UDC to thank for that. And we can talk much more about that during the Q&A. I think, one of the things to remember about these monuments is that, because they are in public spaces, because African Americans in so many of these communities, never have an opportunity to promote their own memory of the war, a very different memory of the war that, of course, acknowledges emancipation. It celebrates the roughly 180,000 Black men who fought in the United States Army against the Confederacy. They celebrate, of course, enslaved people who undermined the Confederacy in various ways. They are left to find ways to remember the past that involve community organization, but never lead to monument dedications. They simply don't have the political pull, and they don't have, in many cases, the financial means to put up monuments. So those two factors together, I think, helps to explain why you don't see monuments, to that sort of celebrate Black soldiers, in front of courthouses in the South or in other public spaces. But that doesn't mean that African Americans did not publicly celebrate their own memory of the war. And of course, in places like Richmond, they did. In April of each year, Emancipation Day celebrations, remembering the arrival of the United States Army in April of 1865. That's a day of liberation for Black Richmonders. For others, it's Juneteenth in places like Texas, and there are other dates as well. And, if you come to Boston, many of you are familiar with the Shaw Memorial. It really was the only public memorial honoring or even recognizing the presence of Black soldiers, United States soldiers, in any part of the country, up until, I should say, I'll just jump ahead, up until 1997, when you have the dedication of the Civil War soldiers, and I think it's this, I forget what the official name is, African American Civil War Memorial in DC in 1997, just a few blocks away from Howard University, of course, the historically Black college or Black university. But it gives you a sense of how few of these monuments and statues occupy our public spaces. And I think, the recent developments, I think, have certainly given people the impression, again, that that this is a recent controversy, that these controversies about monuments really don't go any further back than 2015. And one of the things, I skipped over this photograph, one of the things I just sort of want to impress upon all of you is that this is not the case at all. I could spend another half hour talking about the extent to which African Americans protested the dedication of Confederate monuments, going back to the 1890s. This is just one example from 1970, students at Ole Miss, who of course are burning a Confederate flag down. I don't remember the exact context for this. In Tuskegee, Alabama in 1965, students from Tuskegee Institute spray painted the Confederate statue in its public park. And so there are plenty of examples of this, especially during the Civil Rights era, where African Americans, of course, linked the Confederate statues with continued oppression. They were able, I think, to acknowledge the extent to which these statues were part of a broader landscape or culture of white supremacy. And I think that continues to this day. One of the reasons why you are seeing such a vibrant response to Confederate statues over the last few decades, especially since 2015, but going back a couple decades, is because in many of these communities, African Americans are now represented in local government, city councils, the mayor, the mayor's office, and even beyond. And once you have political power, you can begin, of course, to voice your concerns about the kinds of public monuments that define your public spaces. Remember, we're talking about monuments that are maintained with tax dollars. And so what happened after the George Floyd murder is, in cities across the country, including Richmond, local activists took to the streets and they very directly voiced their anger, frustration with the continued presence of these monuments, but also linked these monuments to more recent kinds of concerns that sort of occupy concerns about the racial climate in this country. Let's put it that way. And Richmond was no exception. All five Confederate monuments were heavily damaged, vandalized. Tagged is the way some people like to refer to it. So this is the Lee Monument before and the Lee Monument after. You can see, of course, those prominent homes that went up around the Lee Monument as that neighborhood developed after 1890. On the right, you can see these little cards. Those are individuals from the Richmond area and a few beyond who were the victims of police violence. And so the Lee Monument became sort of a gathering place, a rallying site for Richmonders after, I should say, throughout the summer of 2020 and right up through the last few months when the Robert E. Lee Monument was finally removed. It wasn't just the tagging that took place. It became a staging ground for all kinds of activities. People camped out. They engaged in, this is a close-up. I'll give you a couple shots here in a second. They engaged in various kinds of demonstrations. Students were regular participants in various kinds of rallies. And these are two ballerinas who sort of used the foundation of the monument, the pedestal itself, as their own stage for some dance, to use as a stage, if you will. And there were voting rights drives, graduation ceremonies. Virginia Commonwealth University is close by. Sports teams showed up and took team photographs. Again, graduates showed up. The important thing that I want you to notice, or one of the important things, is that for many African Americans in Richmond, this was the first time they ever set foot on Monument Avenue, or ended up this close to the Robert E. Lee Monument. And a lot of people who were interviewed were very clear about why that was the case. And it comes down to the fact that this became a predominantly upscale white neighborhood, right? So in a sense, the monuments had achieved what Richmonders had set out to develop in 1890, which was a white neighborhood. And so in a sense, African Americans and others have reclaimed these sites as their own and have actually reinterpreted them in new ways that challenge that pro-Confederate narrative. One of the most interesting things is that at night, somebody had the intelligence to bring a projector. And what they did was they projected images on the monument. It was a huge monument, about 60 feet tall in total. And on the right, you can see Representative John Lewis from Georgia, civil rights activist, Georgia representative who recently passed away. And then, of course, the great Black abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. And so people gathered at night, and a whole Harriet Tubman, George Floyd himself was projected onto the pedestal or the base of the monument. And so again, a kind of reclaiming of these sites and reinterpreting of these sites as something anti-Confederate, as something that helps us to imagine ways of connecting these Confederate monuments to the current challenges that we face on the racial front and elsewhere. And then finally, of course, just in the last few months, all these monuments and pedestals have been removed. Lee himself came down. He was actually sawed in half. They couldn't cart him away in one piece, and so they sawed him in half. One of the interesting things here, I'm going to sort of end with this image, two more images, is the company that was hired to remove the monuments is owned by a black man, Devon Henry. And I put this quote because it's an interesting quote. It comes from John Mitchell. Mitchell was one of the most active, one of the most important Black newspaper editors at the turn of the 20th century. And when the Lee Monument went up, he predicted that one day it would come down. It would come down with the help of African Americans. And that's literally exactly how it happened in September of 2021. So what's happening in Richmond is quite interesting, because what the city has decided is that it's going to hand the monuments over to a local Black History museum. And that's gonna be very interesting to follow, because of course, it's you've got a Black museum that has been given the responsibility to interpret monuments that were intended, in a sense, to erase Black history, right? Those monuments were an attempt to highlight a white memory of the war, but in a way, it was also an attempt to push other narratives away. So monuments are, as much as they are about remembering, they're also about forgetting. And that African-American history, which has become so predominant in recent decades, and is becoming much more present in many public spaces, especially in the South. This is just, I think, the next step. And so again, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. But I've talked too long, and I promise I wouldn't leave time for some questions. So I'm gonna end there. And if there, if you want to go back to a slide, perhaps I can do that. But I'm gonna sort of escape out of this and come back to the viewing room. And let me see here. Stop sharing. Yeah. And so please, if you want to push back in any way, share any thoughts, whatever, please do. I'm all yours.
Kevin, it looks like there's a question in the chat. What, if any,
let me go there.
Statues on Monument Ave.
Yeah. So so real fast from Michael's question, is that Charles Sumner in the background? So I assume, Michael, you're talking about the image of the Kevin Seaford carrying the Confederate flag through the U.S. Capitol. You can find that photograph easily online. It is indeed, of course, Republican senator from Massachusetts, anti-slavery Republican, best remembered, of course, for a speech that he gave in the Senate in 1855, 56, against slavery, which resulted in him getting beaten by a man, a South Carolinian by the name of Preston Brooks, that left him bloodied and forced him out of DC for a couple years. That is Charles Sumner. The other painting that you'll see in that photograph is John Calhoun, senator from South Carolina, the most outspoken sort of pro-slavery senator, arguably in the antebellum period in the Senate. So that contrast is quite interesting. So thanks for that. What, if anything, has replaced the statues on Monument Avenue? Great question. So the pedestals, the statues themselves, the figures, Davis, Jefferson Davis, Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Matthew Fontaine Maury, those came down mainly in September, October of last year. The pedestals only came down, were only removed, I should say, in the last week or two. So that's an important question that Richmond is going to have to, and other cities that have removed these statues and monuments are going to have to figure out. New Orleans is another city that took down 4 in April of 2017. What's interesting is the city hasn't come up with a firm plan of how to move forward. But what's interesting about New Orleans, and I guess it shouldn't be surprising, is that grassroots organizations have taken the initiative to use those spaces. And I think a couple of the pedestals are still there. And so what they're doing is they're placing objects, various kinds of objects that commemorate various aspects of New Orleans culture, African-American culture, et cetera. And some of it's actually quite powerful. And so, that is an important question that a lot of these cities and communities are going to have to face. Once you remove a monument that the community no longer believes represents them, then of course you have perhaps the more difficult question of, all right, how do we move forward together, and how do we reclaim this space, and how do we transform it in a way that represents all of us? That's the challenge. Does the Black History Museum in Richmond want the statues? Yes, they are incredibly enthusiastic. How much of, one thing to keep in mind is these were extremely large statues, monuments on Monument Avenue. They towered, especially the Lee Monument. And so how much of these monuments they take, it'll be interesting to see. I don't know what their square footage looks like. And I would suggest there are other challenges as well. It's not just space. It's, how do you, is it possible to interpret these monuments in an educational setting without sort of simply transferring the kind of the bitterness of that public debate, transferring that from the public space into the museum itself? So staffing is also an issue. Having the right people on board to be able to help people coming from various backgrounds understand and learn from these artifacts. That's going to be a challenge. Some museums have just come out and said, we're not interested. And so I don't know how many. I think there's a museum in Texas that has reached out for one that was removed in Dallas. The University of Texas at Austin took 2 campus Confederate statues, one of Jefferson Davis, I should say, and actually created a space in a museum or library setting for the statue. That seems to have worked out. But some museums are sort of backing away from wanting to take this on, that it's a bit too much, or perhaps it's still too early. That's one way of looking at it. Perhaps we'll see more movement on that front in the next few years. Are there any major monuments that still as yet haven't come down? Absolutely. And the one that you want to look at and is just a tough nut to crack is Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain, it's literally a mountain. And beginning in 1915, the same year that the Ku Klux Klan, the second generation of the Klan, it was sort of phased out by the 1870s, but it came back after, in 1915. And one of their first gatherings, public gatherings, was at the top of Stone Mountain. And it was decided that what Stone Mountain really needed is a large relief carving of Confederate heroes. And they ended up with Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. The sculptor was a man by the name of Borglum. I'm sure I've butchered that name. He was eventually fired after a few years. He didn't complete the project. He was a member of the Klan, but of course, many of you may know him because he went on to take charge of Mount Rushmore, what became Mount Rushmore. Stone Mountain was eventually completed in the 1970s with the help of the state of Georgia. And it has always been a gathering place to celebrate white supremacy from that first meeting of a revitalized Klan in 1915. And there is a lot of talk right now about what to do with it. Where the state is and the sort of agency responsible for Stone Mountain, right now, it looks like rather than removing it, they simply don't have the political will to do that in Georgia, but they are making it looks like a good faith attempt to reimagine the broader landscape. And that what I mean by that is to take a museum that was essentially a museum to the Confederacy and turning it into a real educational space. That's going to take a number of years, and it's not clear that it's even possible. We shall see. But it's the only way, of course, to get a sense of the scale of this thing is to go there. But you can easily find some images online that should give you a sense of what we're talking about. A lot of the larger Confederate monuments have been removed. They're certainly still out there, and I can't rattle them off at the top of my head. Many of what we're talking about are, and you saw some examples in the talk, are the sort of soldier statue. I mean, these statues were mass produced. Many of them were mass produced in northern states. The marble and other stone that was used is coming from northern quarries. And they're not really artistically significant in any way. Obviously, the politics surrounding them is much more problematic, depending on where we're looking. But that's mainly in terms of the number, the hundreds that are left. That's a lot of what we're talking about. And it's going to be a slow drip, I think, for the next couple of years. Every once in a while, you get news that a city council has decided to remove or relocate one. And so that'll continue. And let's see, is UDC still active? Oh yeah, they're still active. Their numbers are much smaller than what it was a few decades ago. They have no, I would say they have very little political leverage, if any. Their brother organization is the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Their numbers are also low. And so they're still out there. And I suspect, that their numbers will continue to drop, as we move forward. I think part of the reason for this is that the personal connection to the Civil War era was still there not that long. In other words, you can imagine Confederate veterans living into the 1930s, even some into the early 1940s. And so, you don't have to go back that far to be reminded of the fact that there are people still living that actually knew from the Civil War era, right, firsthand, knew them personally. And so I think as we still get further from that personal connection to the past, I think, we'll see more shifts in how we think about the war, and I think it'll shape definitely how we think about these public statues, etc.
Kevin, it looks like you may have slid past a question here. Do you know of any other country that has monuments like this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anna. It's interesting that you mentioned sort of Hungary. My wife and I spent some time in Prague a couple of years ago, and it was striking. This was right at the time after the Dylan Roof murders and all of this talk about monuments and flags really got started. And it was interesting walking around a city like Prague and noticing the spaces where these large monuments, celebrations of communism, once stood, and now they're skateboard parks where they're just empty, right? And so I don't know other examples where the losers in the Civil War are so represented across the country, are just clearly represented in prominent public spaces, right? It seems to me the United States is unique in that respect. But I think your question also points to another important point here, and that is that there's nothing timeless about monuments and statues. They come and go all the time for different reasons, and they typically get pulled down during moments of trauma, moments of political chaos, after wars, after revolutions. I mean, our own American Revolution starts with the tearing down of an equestrian statue to King George in New York City in 1776. When the US military entered Baghdad, what did they do? They pulled down a statue of Saddam Hussein. There's nothing timeless about monuments and statues, and there's no fear of losing history if we do so. That's not to say that I'm for or against it. It's just, again, to remind us that removing a statue to Robert E. Lee or a monument honoring Robert E. Lee doesn't erase history. There are still plenty of books about Robert E. Lee that are coming out every day, right? What it does say is that Robert E. Lee is no longer representative of the community, and that there are people in power, right, who have the ability to actually remove it, right? And so I think, again, we need to distinguish between history and memory, how we choose to remember, which is always evolving, right? Depending on who's doing the remembering, who has political power, or what that political power looks like, right? So I hope that sort of helps a little bit. Yeah, Stone Mountain now has a Black CEO. Yeah, I probably shouldn't share this. I am working with a company that is sort of developing a proposal for how to reimagine this space, and there are other companies that are also going to bid on this. And I think from what I'm hearing that he is sincere, that he is doing whatever he can to make this a reality, to really bring about significant change at Stone Mountain. It'll be interesting to watch. I make no predictions here. It's just it's a mess. It's always been. Yeah. Let's see about the Park Service and Gettysburg. I think it's pretty safe to say that the monuments will remain at National Park Service sites, and I don't mind sharing. I'm usually not upfront about sort of where I stand on the broader issue, but when it comes to monuments on National Park Service sites, I tend to take the position that they should remain. And I say that because I think it is an opportunity. It is the one place. I think first, the Park Service site, a battlefield like Gettysburg is a very different place to me compared to, say, a public park in Richmond or in front of a courthouse in Tuskegee, Alabama. I think, with proper funding, the National Park Service could do a phenomenal job of interpreting those monuments in a way that helps us understand the kinds of questions that we're trying to get at today, right? How Americans have attempted to commemorate and remember the Civil War, and why those memories have always been contentious, always been divisive. And I think if you know anything about Gettysburg, those Confederate monuments that line Seminary Ridge, I think can do just that. And if you're looking for a really good recent book about Gettysburg, the author is Jill Titus, Titus, and the book is called Gettysburg 1963. It's about the centennial celebrations that took place at Gettysburg and the Confederate monuments that were dedicated during that decade. A number of them were. The first was Robert E. Lee in 1914, and then right through the early 1970s. And those 1960s, 70s monuments, you can imagine, you've got to understand the civil rights movement. You've got to understand the Cold War era to understand how Americans are thinking about the Civil War in 1963. Let's see, did I miss one here? Yeah, there are, Daniel, I'm just sort of reading through your comment question real fast. There are a number of, I don't know where they are, but there are, I think, 2 places in Europe where they've created parks for these old communist monuments, memorials, etc. And it seems to work well. There is a proposal, well, there are a few individuals in the United States who have imagined something along these lines for Confederate statues. Nothing has come of it, and I don't know if a project like that could ever get off the ground. I think it's interesting. It could be interesting, but it would need a hell of a lot of money, and whether or not it would be the kind of just a public park where you stroll through, or whether it would attempt to do any interpretation, I don't know who would oversee it. And the other thing is that a lot of communities that have removed their monuments are not that willing just to give them up, right? There seems to be, and I think this is a good thing, there seems to be a sense in some communities that they have a responsibility to figure out, if these monuments are to go anywhere, let's make sure that they go somewhere where they can be properly handled, right? Properly interpreted, that they're not turned into another celebration 2.0 of the Confederacy. What's your favorite good monument? Yeah. That's a good question. Look, I love DC, and I still get a little chill whenever I walk up the Lincoln Memorial. I just find that its location within the broader landscape of the mall. The other one, of course, is here in Boston. I showed you the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, the 54th. I'm writing a biography about Robert Gould Shaw right now, and so I spend a lot of time down there trying to get some inspiration. But the Shaw Memorial is just simply, I think it's probably the most important piece of public Civil War art that we have in this country. It's the execution is just brilliant. I think it tells an important story. One, of course, that I suggested wasn't being told publicly, throughout much of the country in 1897 when it was dedicated. But I think it's, when you look at those faces, the reliefs of those Black faces, I mean, it's incredibly powerful. Shaw is interesting to look at as well, but for me, it's always the men that are marching beside him. So I think those are the two.
All right, it looks like that's it. I want to thank everybody for coming out. Thank you, Kevin, for doing this. It was a very interesting talk. Hope you all had a good time.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Stay safe and have a great weekend.
You too.